The device hummed softly, its steady rhythm almost soothing, but for Alexander the sound was a constant reminder of the chaos just around the corner. He stood there, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the dials, his breath shallow and quick. The machine was old enough to seem as though it might fall apart with a single misstep. Yet, in his hands it felt like the key to something far more profound. His heart pounded in his chest and his mind raced with possibilities, each one more thrilling than the last. What lay ahead, he couldn't know, but he was about to find out. Alexander had always been a dreamer. He had always been the kind of person who looked beyond the horizon, who believed that anything was possible if you were bold enough. His obsession with time travel had started when he was young, fed by the science fiction novels he devoured late into the night. In those pages, the boundaries of reality were blurred and anything seemed achievable. As a child, he had fantasized about traveling to distant pasts and uncertain futures, about meeting people long gone and witnessing things yet to come. His fascination only deepened as he grew older. The world around him felt too small, too predictable, too mundane. He wanted something more, and when he first laid hands on the device, he knew he had found it. His small apartment, cluttered with books, papers, and strange blueprints he had drawn in the middle of the night, had become a laboratory of sorts. The machine had started as a collection of parts, wires, buttons, and odd instruments, but over time it had grown into something more substantial, more real. Alexander had poured his heart into it, believing that one day it would work. And now, standing in front of it, he was certain that day had finally arrived. The whirring of the machine grew louder, and for a moment he hesitated. Was it too much? Was he really ready to step into the unknown? He didn't know, but he had to try. His fingers hovered over the final switch. If he flipped it, the fabric of time itself would open up before him, and he would be free to wander through its endless corridors. With a deep breath, he pushed the switch. A blinding light filled the room, so bright that Alexander had to shut his eyes. His body trembled, his pulse thundering in his ears, but he could feel the tug, the pull of something beyond his control, beyond his understanding. The world around him shifted, rippling like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. When the light finally dimmed and the pull ceased, Alexander opened his eyes to find himself standing in the middle of a street. It was quiet, too quiet, and something about the air felt off. He looked around, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't the place he had expected. The buildings were different, older, but not in a nostalgic way. They were cracked, faded, and in some places crumbling. There were no cars on the streets, only an eerie stillness, as if the world had been frozen in time. He glanced at his watch. It was 3:45 p.m., but was it? Was it really the same time? His head spun with confusion. Had he travelled back or forward? He wasn't sure, but something was terribly wrong. His heart pounded in his chest. This was not what he had envisioned. His hand tightened around the straps of his bag, the leather cool and reassuring against his palm. He had to find answers. As he walked down the street, he could sense something, or someone, watching him. It was in the way the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, the way the air felt dense and thick. The buildings loomed like silent, imposing giants, their windows dark, like eyes that had long ago lost their light. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. And then, as he rounded a corner, he saw her. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he approached, he realized it was her, his future self. Her hair was different, streaked with silver, and her face was marked by the years, but the eyes were unmistakable. The same shade of blue, the same sharp, inquisitive gaze. She stood there, motionless, as if waiting for him. For a moment they just stared at each other, both frozen in disbelief. Alexander opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? What explanation could he offer for his presence here? Her lips parted, and her voice came out in a strained whisper. "You shouldn't have done it," she said, her voice full of regret and something else. Fear? "You shouldn't have travelled, Alexander. It's too dangerous." His heart skipped a beat. She knew his name. She knew who he was, but how? Who are you? His voice came out shakier than he intended. Her eyes darkened, and she took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I'm you," she said flatly. I'm the version of you who survived the consequences. I'm the one who learned the hard way. Alexander's pulse quickened. Survived? What do you mean? What's happened? Her face twisted with pain, and she shook her head. I can't explain it all. You have to listen to me, though. This thing you've done, this machine you've built, it's not what you think it is. She stepped closer, her eyes pleading. It's going to destroy you, Alexander. You can't keep traveling. You can't keep trying to change things. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about. A cold shiver ran down his spine. This was impossible. He had been careful, so careful. He had thought everything through, had imagined every scenario, but now there was no escaping the look in her eyes, the fear that had overtaken her features. You have to stop. Now, she whispered urgently. And in that moment, Alexander realized something that he hadn't even considered before. He wasn't in control. Not of time, not of fate. There was something bigger than him at play, something he couldn't understand. Her hand reached out, trembling. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking, don't make the same mistakes I did. But it was too late. The clock had already started ticking, and there was no turning back. The streets were quieter now, but a distant hum filled the air, something mechanical, unnatural. Alexander could feel it in his bones, like the ground itself was trembling with the knowledge of a truth too heavy to carry. He stood there facing the woman, his future self, and for the first time he felt the cold weight of regret settle in his chest. She was still staring at him, eyes wide with an unspoken urgency. Her voice, when it came again, was strained, as though she was trying to pull words from a place far too deep to reach. You don't understand, do you? You think it's just a machine. But it's more than that. It's a trap, Alexander, a trap that won't let you go once you step inside. She looked down at the ground as if the earth beneath them was hiding secrets too dangerous to reveal. Then how do I stop it? His voice came out hoarse, desperate. Every cell in his body screamed at him to act, like to fix whatever he had done wrong. But there was no clear path forward. How could there be when he hadn't even fully understood the consequences of his actions? She swallowed hard, eyes flickering with something that was almost a mix of sadness and warning. You can't undo it, but you can prevent it from getting worse. You can stop yourself from making the same mistakes that I did before it's too late. Before he could ask what she meant, the air shifted again, heavier this time, like a storm was coming. He felt it, the pulse in the air around him, a static charge that prickled his skin. The city, or whatever this version of it was, began to change. The buildings, once frozen in their crumbling decay, seemed to breathe with life, their outlines shifting, warping, as if time itself was being distorted by an unseen force. He stepped back instinctively, his eyes darting to his future self, but she was already moving. Fast, as if she had seen something he hadn't. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight. We have to go, now! Before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from behind them, sharp and jarring. Alexander turned just in time to see a figure stumbling toward them from the mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It was another person, but unlike anything he had seen before. This figure moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking in sudden, erratic motions, its face half concealed by a mask of shadows. "Who is that?" Alexander gasped, pulling away from his future self. "Another version of you," she said, her voice trembling. "One who never made it out, one who lost control, who kept trying to change things, and it—" She paused, her throat working as if the words were too painful to say. "It twisted him, turned him into something else. You have to run now." With a force he hadn't expected, she pulled him toward the nearest alleyway. They moved quickly, but the figure, his future self, or rather the thing that had once been him, was relentless. It followed them, dragging its feet, its eyes vacant and empty, like a shadow of the man who had once been. The streetlights flickered as they passed, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally, as if they too were fleeing. "Where are we going?" Alexander demanded, breathless. The alley seemed endless, and the ground beneath his feet felt wrong, unstable. Each step was heavy, like wading through thick mud, yet the sound of the creature's footsteps behind them grew louder, closer. "To the machine, Sheen," she said, panic. "It's the only way to fix this. It's the only way to fix this. But you need to promise me something. Promise me you'll never use it again, no matter what you think you can change, no matter how tempting it is. Time, it's not something to be toyed with." Alexander's mind spun. The urgency in her voice, the fear, the desperation, it all felt like a warning that was far too late. But there was no time to process it. He had to act, to do something to stop whatever nightmare he had unleashed. They reached the end of the alley, and there it was, the machine. It stood in the middle of an open square, as if waiting for them, its cold metal surface gleaming under the harsh light of the street lamps. But it was different now. The once comforting hum was gone. Instead, it emitted a low throbbing sound, almost like a heartbeat, a pulse that seemed to echo from the deepest part of Alexander's chest. "It's here," his future self said softly. "This is where it ends. But you have to understand, this isn't just about you. It's about everything. The fabric of time, if you keep pulling on it, it'll unravel completely, and you'll be lost in a place you can never return from." Alexander nodded, though doubt lingered in his chest. How could he be sure? How could he trust the version of himself that was now standing in front of him, broken, worn, desperate? But there was no time to question it. The creature, his twisted future self, was getting closer, its movements jerking more erratically with every passing moment. He could hear its laboured breathing now, could feel its presence like a shadow creeping up behind him. "Make it stop," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. His future self grabbed his hands, her grip firm, her face softening for just a moment. "Do it. You have no other choice." With shaking hands, Alexander stepped forward and pulled the lever on the machine. The familiar hum returned, but this time it felt different, colder, more final. The air around them shimmered like ripples on the surface of a pond, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, warping in a way that made Alexander's stomach lurch. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The street was silent, the distant hum of the machine faded, the creature was gone. His future self was still standing next to him, but her expression had softened, the fear replaced by something else. Relief, perhaps? Or was it acceptance? Alexander turned to look at her, but she wasn't there anymore. The city was still. The buildings, the streets, the alleyways, they were as they had been before he had travelled. No cracks, no decay. Time had returned to its normal rhythm. But something in Alexander had shifted. He knew, deep down, that he could never look at time the same way again. The weight of his future self's warning echoed in his mind, louder now than any machine could ever be. He had come so close to losing everything. Would he ever truly be free of the consequences of his actions? Only time would tell. But for now, the silence was all he needed to hear. The silence around Alexander was unnerving. The city, if it could still be called that, was eerily still, as if holding its breath. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of streetlights casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something just beyond the edge of his vision, lurking in the silence. He stood in the square, the hum of the machine still reverberating through the air. It was over, or at least he thought it was. The twisted version of himself had disappeared and the machine had stopped. But the sense of unease remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. It had only been moments, yet it felt as though an eternity had passed since he had pulled the lever. There was no time to waste. He had to move, to find answers, to make sense of everything that had happened. He turned to go, but as he stepped away from the machine, he froze. A figure appeared at the far end of the street, a silhouette in the darkness, standing still, watching him. He couldn't make out the details, but there was something familiar about the shape, something that felt wrong. A voice, soft and hesitant, broke the stillness. "You shouldn't have done it." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. He spun around to face her. It was his future self again, but she wasn't the same. Her eyes were wild now, frantic, and there was a tremor in her hands. The calm, collected version of herself he had seen before was gone. She looked shattered. What happened to you?" he asked, fear creeping into his voice. She took a shaky step toward him, her eyes darting nervously around the square. "It's not over. You think it's over, but you've only made it worse." "Worse? How?" Alexander's voice was tight with confusion. She was almost crying now, her breath coming in short gasps. "You don't understand. Every time you travel, every time you change something, you leave a hole, a crack in time, and it's growing. Every time you pull that lever, you risk it all." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Every time he used the machine? Was it true? Could it really be this dangerous? Suddenly, the air around them seemed to change. The temperature dropped, and Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable again, like the city was shifting, threatening to collapse in on itself. "What do we do?" he asked, panic rising in his chest. His future self didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in thought, staring at the machine, her face a mask of anguish. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We have to find the source. The machine, it's not just here. It's in you, in your mind. The cracks in time, they're spreading." A low growl echoed from the shadows behind them, and Alexander's blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he turned to face the sound. Emerging from the darkness were figures, more of them, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions of rage, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "They're here," his future self said, her voice trembling with fear. "The ones who followed you, the ones who were— what do you call them? The echoes? The ones who were left behind." Alexander took a step back, his heart racing. The creatures, there were so many of them, their bodies warped and deformed by the same twisted influence that had altered his future self. They moved with a jerky, erratic motion, as if they were stuck in some kind of time loop, unable to break free. "What are they?" Alexander demanded, his voice barely more than a gasp. "They're you," she said, her eyes filled with dread. "Versions of you that have failed. They kept trying to change things, they kept reaching for the impossible, and now they're trapped in time, and so are we." The first creature lunged at them, and Alexander barely had time to react. His future self pushed him aside, just as the creature's clawed hands swiped through the air, missing him by inches. "Run!" she screamed. They dashed through the streets, the creatures behind them, gaining with every step. Alexander's breath came in ragged gasps as they sprinted, the world around them blurring, the sounds of pursuit growing louder with each passing moment. They rounded a corner and found themselves at a dead-end alley, the walls looming high on either side. "No way out!" Alexander cried, his panic rising to a fever pitch. "We do." His future self grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with desperation. "We have to get to the machine. We can't outrun them, but we can make one last attempt to fix this." The creatures were closing in, their guttural growls echoing in the alley. Alexander's mind raced. Was there really a way to fix this? Was it possible to undo everything he had done? The future self pulled him toward a nearby building, dragging him inside just as the creatures closed in. Inside, the darkness swallowed them, and for a moment they were hidden from view. But Alexander knew it wouldn't last long. "We need a plan," he said, trying to steady his breath. She nodded, her face pale, but her eyes were clear now, as though she had found some kind of resolve. "The machine," she repeated. "We can use it to collapse the cracks, but we have to synchronize it, create a feedback loop. You have to trust me." Trust her? How could he trust someone who was him? How could he trust anyone after everything that had happened? But there was no time for second-guessing. He nodded, swallowing his doubts. They had no choice. The creatures were close now, their eyes shining in the dark. The future self looked at Alexander, her expression one of quiet determination. "Are you ready?" "I have no choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They rushed toward the machine, but the creatures were there, blocking their path. The air around them thickened, the sound of their breathing and growling echoing like a death sentence. It was time. "We have to do it now," she shouted. With one last desperate glance at his future self, Alexander stepped forward, his fingers trembling as he reached for the lever. The creatures closed in, and as he pulled it, everything changed again. The world around them trembled, the fabric of time stretching and warping. The machine hummed, its sound like a heartbeat, steady and unyielding. But Alexander could feel it. Something was different this time. The air around him pulsed with energy, heavy and thick, like the very fabric of reality was bending to the will of the machine. He glanced at his future self, her face etched with determination and fear. She was already moving, her hand reaching toward the machine's console, her fingers shaking. "It's now or never," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet there was an intensity in it that sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. But as he stepped closer, he heard them. Louder now, the creatures. The echoes of his past selves were closing in, their grotesque figures lurching toward him, eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. There were so many of them now, and their growls filled the air, a constant pulsing sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones. "No more running," one of the creatures shouted, its voice raspy and twisted. They had him cornered. There was no escape now. The alleyway was narrow, and the door leading to the machine had already been blocked by two of the creatures. Their faces contorted with rage. Alexander's breath quickened as he looked at his future self. She was still working furiously at the machine, her face a mask of concentration. Sweat dripped from her brow as she flipped switches and turned dials, trying to synchronize the machine's settings. But even from where he stood, Alexander could see it wasn't going to be easy. The machine was unstable, and the feedback loops weren't aligning as they should. Come on, she muttered under her breath, her hands moving rapidly. The creatures were closing in. There was no time left. We need to act now, he shouted, his voice panicked but filled with a desperate kind of resolve. If we don't, we're done for. Just give me a moment, she snapped, her voice tight with fear. Alexander's eyes darted to the creatures, now only a few feet away. Their eyes glowed brighter, their mouths twisted into cruel, mocking smiles. One of them, a version of himself that looked so far gone it barely resembled a human being anymore, reached out toward him, its clawed hands scraping across the ground. The other creatures followed, moving in an eerie, synchronized pattern. You shouldn't have messed with time, the creature hissed, its voice low and guttural. Now you'll pay for it, just like we did. The words echoed in Alexander's mind, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this truly the consequence of his actions? Was this his punishment for messing with time, for trying to change the course of his own fate? You're wrong, Alexander said, his voice sharp and defiant. I'm not like you. I'm fixing this. I'm making it right. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Could he ever make it right? Could any of them ever fix what had been broken? The creature lunged, but just as its hand was about to close around Alexander's throat, a flash of light erupted from the machine. The world seemed to pause for a moment, everything suspended in time. The air crackled with energy as the machine's hum reached a crescendo, the feedback loops finally aligning with a sudden explosive force. Then, everything exploded in a blinding light. Alexander was thrown backward, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. He gasped for air, his vision blurry as the aftershocks of the explosion reverberated through him. The world seemed to spin around him, distorted, as if the very essence of time had been shaken to its core. Get up! His future self's voice called out, sharp and frantic. It's not over yet! He pushed himself up, shaking his head to clear the fog from his mind. The alleyway around him was no longer the same. The walls of the buildings were cracked and warped, as if reality itself had been torn open. The creatures, the echoes of himself, were still there, but they were distorted, their movements jerky, as though time was fighting against them, pulling them in every direction. You can't stop us, one of them hissed, its voice a mix of anger and despair. You can't fix this. We'll see about that, Alexander spat, his mind clearer now, his resolve solidifying. With a deep breath, he turned toward the machine. His future self was already there, the panels flickering as she made adjustments with frenzied speed. Is it working? He asked, his voice urgent. It's working, but we need to synchronize the timeline, she replied, her eyes wide with fear and determination. If we don't, the cracks will spread. We'll be lost. Forever. The creatures were closing in again, their forms twisting, as though the very act of their existence was unraveling the fabric of time. They had no place in this world, but that didn't stop them trying to tear it apart. Alexander moved toward the machine, his fingers shaking as he reached for the lever once more. The creatures were almost on top of them now. There was no time left. His heart raced in his chest as he positioned his hands on the cold metal of the lever. Do it! His future self screamed. Now! With a final desperate push, he pulled the lever. The machine roared to life again, a surge of power shooting through the air. The creatures shrieked as the energy from the machine enveloped them, the force of the feedback loop pulling them apart. Their bodies writhed, twisting in agony as the light from the machine grew blinding, consuming everything in its path. Hold on! Alexander shouted. reaching for his future self, but the light was too bright and the force too powerful. For a moment, everything went black. When he opened his eyes again, the alley was empty. The creatures were gone. The machine was still there, humming softly, but it was no longer the same. The distortion in the air had faded. The fabric of time, though still fragile, seemed to have stabilized. He was alive. They had made it. But as he looked around, something in him had changed. The city, whatever this place was, felt different. It wasn't the same as before. Something was missing, something important. And then he realized the future he had just witnessed, the echoes of his past selves, were gone. Time had reset, but at what cost? His future self was beside him, her face unreadable. She hadn't said a word, but Alexander knew they had done it. They had saved time, but they had sacrificed the only thing that had kept them tethered to it. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and sorrow. His future self nodded, her eyes filled with an understanding that only she, and now he, could comprehend. Time was no longer their enemy, but it was a constant reminder of the cost of trying to change what could never be changed. And though they had won, Alexander knew there was no going back. As the light of the machine faded and the final echoes of the distorted creatures vanished into the air, Alexander stood motionless, his heart still pounding in his chest. The world around him had shifted once more. Time, though fragile, had stabilized, at least for now. The distant hum of the machine, now softer and less violent, felt like a heartbeat in a quiet room, settling into its proper rhythm. He turned slowly to his future self, still standing by the machine. The look in her eyes had softened, though there was a weight to it, a quiet understanding between them. They had crossed a threshold, one that no one could ever truly come back from. They had undone the damage, but it was clear now that the consequences of their actions would reverberate forever. "You did it," she said, her voice a mix of relief and something deeper. "We did it." Alexander nodded, his throat tight. He had no words. How could he explain the flood of emotions racing through him? Fear, regret, hope. The very thing he had been trying to avoid was now right in front of him, and yet he could not help but feel that some part of him had been irrevocably altered. They had won, but victory came with its own cost. The alley around them was still, the air thick with silence, yet the world beyond it, the city, the streets, the people, felt distant, like it wasn't quite their reality anymore. He looked over at the machine, humming quietly in its place. Its power, once so dangerous, now felt like a strange comfort. But the knowledge that they had no way of predicting how time would unfold from here gnawed at him. "I don't know if we can ever truly make things right," Alexander said, his voice low. His future self glanced at him, her face a mix of sorrow and resignation. "We did what we could. Now we have to live with that. The timeline's restored, but we don't know how it will play out. We can't control everything." "Will things be different?" he asked, the uncertainty hanging between them like a fog. "I don't know," she replied honestly, her voice steady despite the raw emotions in her eyes. "But that's the way it always is. Time is fluid. It shifts and it changes. We just have to hope that it moves in the right direction." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. A thought struck him, one he had been trying to ignore, but now it was impossible to suppress. "What about the others?" he asked. "The versions of me, will they still be out there?" She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No, they're gone. They were never meant to exist. When we fixed the timeline, we erased them. They were fragments, echoes of a future that no longer exists." A shudder ran through him at the thought, a fleeting sense of loss for something that wasn't even real. But as much as it hurt, there was relief too. The twisted versions of himself, those dark reflections, were no longer there to torment him. He had eradicated them by fixing the broken thread of time. He looked up at her then, his mind racing through everything that had happened. There was so much more to understand, but one thing was certain: they had both changed. They were no longer the same people who had started this journey. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away, but her eyes softened. "I'm still trying to figure that out." He nodded, understanding all too well. They had both been through too much to fully comprehend it now, but time would give them the answers, if they could be patient enough to wait for them. The quiet that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. Alexander stood there for a while, unsure of what to do next. The world outside seemed still, the streets beyond the alley empty. It was almost as though they were the last two people in existence, suspended in time, waiting for something to happen. "I think we need to go," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "We don't know how long the effects of this will last, and we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." "Right," he agreed. The adrenaline that had kept him moving now began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. He was physically drained, the weight of everything they had done finally catching up to him. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite name, a sense of hope that began to spark in the depths of his chest. As they made their way out of the alley, the streets stretched before them, the city still feeling out of place, yet oddly comforting. The buildings, though damaged, stood firm. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a golden glow over the scene, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled into Alexander's bones. "Do you think things will be the same?" he asked as they walked side by side, the weight of the question hanging in the air. "Nothing is ever the same," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But that doesn't mean it can't be better. It won't be easy, but we'll make it work." Alexander didn't respond, but the words sank deep into him. They would make it work. They had to. As they approached a narrow street corner, a figure appeared ahead of them, stepping out from the shadows. For a moment, Alexander froze, but as the figure came closer, he saw that it was a woman, a stranger, yet one with a familiar look in her eyes. She stopped in front of them, her gaze sweeping over Alexander and his future self. "I was told to find you," the woman said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it. "We need to talk." Alexander exchanged a glance with his future self, and without a word, they stepped closer to the stranger. "Who are you?" Alexander asked cautiously. "I'm someone who's been waiting for you to fix things," the woman replied cryptically. "You've restored the timeline, but there's still a larger issue at play." A shiver ran down his spine, and as he looked at the stranger, he realized that their journey, this strange tangled fate they had tried to untangle, was far from over. "I think we've just started," his future self said, her voice full of a new determination. And Alexander knew, deep down, that this was true. Whatever the consequences of their actions, they were now part of something far greater. They hadn't finished. The city stretched before them, its broken edges softened by the glow of the setting sun. The air was cool, yet the humidity of the day lingered, as though the world itself was exhaling, recovering from the chaos they had unleashed. Alexander felt the weight of the past hour's decisions pressed down on him. He had no idea what lay ahead, but there was one thing he was sure of now. The journey they had set out on, the one that had consumed him for so long, had led to something far more complex than he had ever imagined. The stranger, a woman with sharp, knowing eyes and a quiet resolve, had explained little, but her presence seemed to validate every fear, every doubt Alexander had buried deep within him. She had brought them to a place where questions grew rather than answers. And now they stood before a new challenge, not in a place of resolution, but one of possibility. As they walked together, the streets of the city felt different. They no longer seemed like a backdrop for a struggle. Instead, they felt like a canvas, waiting to be painted with new decisions, new futures. The buildings still stood tall, though cracked, the scars of a world that had been remade in a moment. It felt almost as if they, too, were part of the healing process. "Do you believe it's over?" Alexander asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. He wasn't sure if he was asking her or himself. She glanced over at him, her face unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. "No," she said, "it's not over, but we're closer than we were." A sudden gust of wind swept through the alleyway, and the world seemed to shift with it, as if time itself was holding its breath. Alexander thought about everything they had sacrificed, all the mistakes, all the fragments of his past that were now erased. It was almost impossible to accept that it had all come down to this. But he had fought too hard to back down now. They stopped in front of a small, abandoned building, the door slightly ajar. The stranger led the way, and after a brief hesitation, Alexander and his future self followed her inside. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a flickering lamp on a table. It was an office of sorts, cluttered with papers, maps, and various strange artifacts. But amidst the chaos, one thing stood out: a small, glowing device perched on a pedestal in the centre of the room. Alexander's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. "What is this?" he asked, his voice hushed. The stranger didn't answer right away, instead walking over to the device and gently placing her hand on it. The soft light it emitted flickered in rhythm with her movements. "It's the next step," she said. "The device is a key to something larger. It will show you the way forward." Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. He had no idea what this new tool was meant to unlock, but he could feel the weight of its importance. It was a symbol of their struggle, their journey, but also of what they were about to face. His future self stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the device. "It's not the end we're looking for," she said quietly, "but it's a beginning, and that's what matters." Alexander wasn't sure if he believed her, but there was something in her voice that made him wonder. She had never spoken like that before, so certain, so hopeful. The woman standing beside them, this stranger, had become the bridge between the chaos they had just barely escaped and the future they were still building. "We're not the same people we were when we started," Alexander said softly, his voice full of quiet wonder. The realization had only just fully hit him. He was no longer that man lost in time, desperate to fix everything. He was different now, changed. His future self turned to face him, and for a moment their eyes locked in shared understanding. They had done things, terrible things, but they had also survived, together. He could see now that the journey had not only been about saving the world, but about saving each other, saving himself. "I don't think we ever could have been the same," she said, her voice softer than before, but filled with warmth. "We've seen things, done things, but we've also learned. We know what matters now." Alexander smiled, a genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He had been afraid that whatever they did, however they fixed the timeline, it would leave him hollow, lost in the echo of his own mistakes. But here, in this moment, he felt whole. "We can't change the past," he murmured, "but we can change the future." The stranger nodded, her face as impassive as ever, but there was something in her gaze that acknowledged what he had just said. They were all part of this journey now, together, moving forward into a future that was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the possibilities of what they could create. They gathered around the device, the quiet hum of its energy filling the room. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Alexander felt ready to face whatever came next. The stranger moved to the pedestal and activated the device with a series of gestures. The room seemed to shift, the edges of reality bending around them, and Alexander felt the air thicken with anticipation. As the light from the device intensified, a wave of calm washed over him. It was as if everything they had done, everything they had suffered through, had led them here, to this single moment. He wasn't sure where it would take them, but it didn't matter. They were together, and that was enough. "We've come this far," his future self said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Now we take the next step." And with that, they stepped into the unknown. As the device flickered one last time and the world around them swirled, Alexander understood. The future wasn't something they could control, but it was something they could shape. And as long as they had each other, there was no challenge too great. The lesson was clear. Every moment, every decision, no matter how small, held the potential for change. They had survived, they had learned, and now they would move forward, one step at a time. The adventure wasn't over, but the story had come full circle.